Picture this: a shadow moves without sound, a whisper of cold air against your neck. Then you hear it, the faintest breath, too close, too slow. You turn, but it's too late. The words of Bram Stoker's Dracula echo in your mind. Listen to them, the children of the night. What music they make, vampires. They've haunted our darkest fears and brightest fantasies for centuries, lurking in the corners of folklore, literature, and even history itself. But where did these creatures of the night truly come from? Are they merely figments of our imagination? Or could there be something more unsettling buried in the past? From the blood-drinking demons of ancient Mesopotamia to the aristocratic predators of Gothic novels, vampires have slithered through time, shape-shifting to reflect our deepest anxieties. They're not just monsters, they're mirrors. In some cultures, they were restless spirits punishing the living. In others, they were warnings against forbidden desires. But why do these legends persist? Why does the idea of immortality at the cost of our humanity fascinate us so deeply? Tonight, we're peeling back the veil on one of history's most enduring nightmares. We'll trace the bloody footsteps of vampires from their earliest whispered origins to their modern-day dominance in books, films, and even our collective psyche. Along the way, you'll meet real-life figures who inspired the myth, uncover ancient rituals meant to ward off the undead, and discover how a single word vampire became synonymous with terror. So light a candle, lock your windows, and let's step into the shadows together. Long before the word vampire slithered into our language, ancient civilizations were already haunted by creatures eerily similar to the bloodthirsty monsters we know today. Take the Ekimmu of Mesopotamia, one of the earliest recorded vampire-like entities in human history. These weren't elegant aristocrats in capes, but vengeful spirits of the improperly buried, rising from their graves to drain the life from the living. Cuneiform tablets from over 4,000 years ago describe them as invisible forces that brought sickness, nightmares, and even death, whispering through the walls of homes at night. Sound familiar? Then there's Lilith, a figure woven into Hebrew mythology long before she appeared in medieval folklore. Originally depicted as a winged demon in Babylonian texts, she transformed into a night-prowling terror who refused to submit to Adam, choosing instead to feast on newborns and seduce sleeping men. Unlike later vampires, Lilith didn't just drink blood, she stole breath, a subtle but chilling parallel to the life-sucking beasts that would follow. Ancient amulets and incantation bowls have been unearthed, inscribed with prayers to ward her off, proving how deeply these fears were etched into daily life. But perhaps the most fascinating evidence comes from archaeology. In places like Bulgaria and Greece, skeletons have been found pinned to their graves with iron rods through their chests, their mouths stuffed with stones, gruesome precautions against the undead. These weren't superstitions, they were calculated acts of terror, driven by a belief that some corpses refused to stay dead. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the hills of the Levant, our ancestors weren't just telling campfire stories. They were documenting what they truly believed lurked in the dark, and that belief would only grow stronger with time. Egypt's ancient sands hold tales far older than even the Mesopotamian horrors, deities who drank blood not out of hunger, but divine wrath. At the heart of this pantheon stood Sekhmet, the lioness goddess whose very name meant the powerful one. When Ra, the sun god, sent her to punish humanity for rebellion, her rampage was so savage she nearly wiped out all life. Her thirst wasn't metaphorical. Temple texts describe her lapping up blood like water, her jaws dripping crimson. To stop her, the gods tricked her with beer dyed red, the first recorded instance of blood substitution in mythology. But Sekhmet's legacy didn't end there. Priests performed rituals with red ochre and wine, symbolically recreating her feast to appease her fury. Here, blood wasn't just sustenance, it was power, a sacred currency between gods and mortals. Then there's Wadjet, the serpent goddess coiled in the shadows of Egyptian lore. Unlike Sekhmet's fiery destruction, Wadjet's consumption was silent, insidious. As protector of Lower Egypt, she was often depicted spitting venom or drinking the blood of enemies, a divine assassin who drained life force instead of spilling it. Amulets bearing her image were buried with the dead, not just to guard them, but to warn away other spirits who might crave their vitality. The parallels to vampire legends are unmistakable, a creature that takes without a struggle, leaving no mark but weakness in its wake. But the most chilling connection lies in the Egyptian concept of the Ka, the life force that needed blood to survive after death. Tomb inscriptions detail offerings of animal blood poured into vessels for the deceased to drink. Without it, the Ka would starve or seek nourishment elsewhere. Sound familiar? Centuries later, European folklore would whisper of revenants creeping from graves to steal the breath or blood of the living. Even the vampire's infamous aversion to sunlight finds an echo in Egyptian myth. Demons like Apep, the serpent of chaos, were said to perish beneath Ra's rays. What makes these stories so compelling isn't just their antiquity, it's how they reveal a universal truth. From the Nile to the Carpathians, humans have always feared what hunts in the dark, what takes without permission. The Egyptian blood drinkers weren't monsters in the modern sense. They were expressions of a world where death and life bled into one another. And when those stories traveled carried by traders, conquerors, and storytellers, they planted seeds that would centuries later blossom into the vampire myths we know today. The Greeks and Romans didn't just fear the dark, they populated it with creatures whose hunger for blood would echo through the ages. Take Lamia, the queen-turned monster of Greek myth. Once a beautiful ruler, her tragic tale began when Hera, consumed by jealousy, cursed her to devour her own children. Grief twisted Lamia into something far worse, a serpentine demon who stalked the night, snatching infants from their cradles and draining their blood. Poets like Aristophanes described her as half-woman, half-beast, with eyes she could remove to sleep while her body prowled. But Lamia wasn't just a bogeyman for misbehaving children. She embodied a deeper terror, the predator who wears a familiar face. Her habit of seducing young men before revealing her true nature would later inspire vampire legends of beautiful monsters luring victims to their doom. Then there's Impusa, a shape-shifting horror serving Hecate, goddess of witchcraft. Unlike Lamia's tragic origins, Impusa was pure malice. She'd appear as a gorgeous woman, luring travelers with promises of shelter, only to reveal clashing bronze legs and flaming hair as she drained them dry. Ancient playwrights like Philostratus warned of her tricks, describing how she'd weaken prey with lust before feasting. Sound familiar? This blend of allure and brutality would resurface centuries later in vampire lore, from Carmilla to Dracula. But perhaps the most chilling precursor to the vampire was Rome's Strix. These owl-like demons flew on leathery wings, sneaking into homes to suck the blood, and sometimes the flesh, of sleeping victims. Roman poet Ovid wrote of them in Fasti, describing how they'd curse entire households with a single visit. Parents hung charms of wool and coral over cribs to repel them, believing the Strix could smell fear. Unlike the Greek spirits, the Strix had no tragic backstory. They were hunger incarnate, and their legacy endured. Centuries later, Slavic villagers would tell nearly identical tales of strigoi, undead beings with the same name, the same thirst. What ties these ancient horrors together isn't just their appetite for blood. It's how they codified the rules of vampirism long before the word existed. Lamia taught us monsters could hide behind beauty. Impusa proved they might stalk the roads we walk by day, and the Strix showed they'd hunt us where we feel safest, in our beds. These weren't just stories, they were warnings, carved into the collective imagination so deeply that when medieval Europe began digging up undead corpses, they already knew what to look for. The bones of these ancient nightmares never truly decayed. They just waited, patient as the grave, for new generations to resurrect them. Far from the marble temples of Greece and Rome, in the thick forests and frozen villages of Eastern Europe, the vampire myth took on a new, more visceral form. Here, the creatures of the night weren't just spirits or gods. They were your neighbors, your relatives, people you'd shared bread with before they returned from the grave. The Slavs called them Vampyre or Strigoi, words that would eventually twist into the vampire we know today. But these weren't the charming aristocrats of Gothic fiction. They were bloated, purple-skinned horrors, reeking of decay, with elongated fingernails and teeth stained by the dirt of their own graves. What made the Slavic vampire so terrifying was its origin. Unlike the divine punishment of Lamia or the cursed fate of Lilith, anyone could become one. Die unbaptized, you might rise, suffer a violent death, your soul could fester. Even something as simple as a cat jumping over your coffin was enough to doom you to undeath. Villages lived in fear of the Vampyre's return, and their burial rituals reflected it. Corpses were staked through the chest not with wood, but with iron or hawthorn, metals believed to sever the connection between body and soul. Some were decapitated, their heads placed between their knees to confuse them if they tried to walk. Others were buried face down, so if they dug upward, they'd only go deeper into the earth. But the precautions didn't stop there. In Bulgaria, grave diggers would pierce the deceased's heart with a nail, then stuff the mouth with garlic or a brick to stop them from chewing their way free. In Romania, suspected strigoi were exhumed and their hearts burned, the ashes mixed with water and given to the sick as a cure. These weren't superstitions, they were acts of survival. Because when crops failed or wells ran dry, when a sudden plague struck a single family, the blame fell on the dead who refused to stay dead. The Strigoi's spread wasn't just folklore, it was fear made tangible. As these stories traveled west, carried by traders and invading armies, they merged with local beliefs, morphing into the creatures of German Nachtsire or the French Revenant. But the Slavic influence remained. When the word vampire first entered European dictionaries in the early 18th century, it came from Serbian reports of exhumed corpses with fresh blood on their lips. Suddenly, the world took notice. Scholars, priests, and even emperors wrote about these horrors, turning peasant fears into a continental obsession. What the Slavs understood, and what we still feel today, is that the scariest monsters aren't the ones lurking in distant forests. They're the ones who used to sit at our tables. The Vampyre wasn't just a story, it was a warning. Death doesn't always take the first time, and sometimes the grave is just a door. By the time the Middle Ages gripped Europe, the vampire had evolved from myth into something far more terrifying, a scapegoat for the inexplicable horrors of daily life. Plague after plague swept across the continent, wiping out entire villages overnight. Crops failed without cause, children sickened with no visible ailment. And in the absence of science, fear filled the gaps. People didn't just believe in vampires, they needed to, because if death had a face, it could be fought. Few cases illustrate this hysteria better than the Arnold Paole incident in 1731, Serbia. Paole was a former soldier who reportedly died in a haystack accident, only for villagers to claim he returned months later, strangling neighbors in their sleep. Livestock began dropping dead, their blood mysteriously drained. When authorities exhumed Paole's body, they found an intact corpse with fresh blood trickling from its mouth. The description in the official report reads like something from a nightmare. His skin had peeled away to reveal new nails. His heart was full of liquid blood, and his limbs were pliable as though living. The response was brutal. They drove a stake through his chest, burned the body, and repeated the grisly ritual with 4 other suspected vampires in the graveyard. But Paole wasn't an isolated case. In Bohemia, the town of Hermersdorf exhumed 6 corpses in 1741, each showing signs of undead activity: swollen tongues, distended bellies, teeth clenched around their own burial shrouds. In France, the revenants of Auvergne were said to rise during epidemics, their groans heard echoing through fog-choked valleys. Even the church, which initially dismissed vampire lore as peasant superstition, found itself entangled. Priests performed exorcisms on graves, and bishops wrote treatises on how to identify the undead. The rituals themselves were as varied as they were horrifying. In Germany, suspected Nachtiras had their mouths stuffed with soil to stop them from eating their burial shrouds, a sign they were consuming their own flesh in the grave. In Hungary, bodies were tied with nets, the knots meant to confuse the vampire's spirit. Some villages went further, dismembering corpses and scattering the pieces across multiple graves, a practice that blurred the line between folklore and mutilation. What's chilling isn't just the brutality of these acts, but the logic behind them. Medieval Europeans didn't stake corpses because they wanted to believe in monsters, they did it because the alternative was worse. If a plague killed only one family or livestock perished without marks, the simplest explanation was that something, or someone, was feeding. Vampires became a twisted form of public health measure. By destroying the infected, dead, communities believed they could stop the spread of death itself. This panic wasn't confined to the shadows. It reached the highest levels of society. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, frustrated by the waves of grave desecration, sent her personal physician to investigate. His conclusion: vampires didn't exist, but the real horror lay in the mass psychological breakdown they revealed. Yet even his report couldn't extinguish the fear, because in a world where death was constant and random, the vampire offered something perversely comforting: a reason. A target, a way to fight back against the dark. In the mist-shrouded forests of 15th century Wallachia, a prince carved his name into history with methods so brutal they would echo for centuries, not just as history, but as nightmare. Vlad III, known as Dracula, son of the dragon, was no vampire, but his deeds were monstrous enough to blur the lines between man and myth. His reign was a masterclass in psychological warfare, where impaled corpses formed grotesque forests outside city gates, a warning to enemies and subjects alike. Ottoman envoys who refused to remove their turbans found them nailed to their skulls. Traitors were boiled alive, and when Saxon merchants betrayed him, Vlad had their limbs pierced with horseshoes before leaving them to rot in the sun. This wasn't just cruelty, it was theater, a calculated display meant to paralyze foes with dread. Yet the darkest irony lies in how this very real monster became fiction's most famous vampire. Bram Stoker didn't pluck the name Dracula from thin air. He found it in a history book where Vlad's atrocities were recorded in chilling detail. The connection wasn't just the name, though. Stoker's Dracula shared Vlad's aristocratic bearing, his strategic genius, and most of all, his obsession with blood. Vlad didn't drink it, but he weaponized it, using rivers of the stuff to cement his power. The parallels were too potent to ignore: a tyrant who ruled by fear, who seemed to defy death itself, surviving countless battles and betrayals. But how did a Wallachian warlord become permanently tangled with the undead? The answer lies in the whispers that outlived him. After Vlad's death in 1476, beheaded in battle, his head displayed on a pike, his body was said to vanish from its grave. Local legends claimed he rose at night to punish the wicked, a trope straight from Slavic vampire lore. Even his birthplace, the shadowy region of Transylvania, became shorthand for Gothic horror. By the time Stoker penned his novel in 1897, the real Dracula had already been mythologized into something beyond human, a symbol of immortal evil. Separating fact from fiction reveals something far more fascinating than any vampire tale. Vlad's brutality wasn't random, it was a response to a lifetime of trauma. Taken hostage by the Ottomans as a child, forced to watch his father's assassination, and betrayed by his own nobility, he ruled a fractured land surrounded by enemies. His impalements mirrored Ottoman execution methods, turning their own tactics against them. Even his infamous Forest of the Dead outside Targovist was a strategic move, halting an advancing Ottoman army by sheer horror. The man was monstrous, but his monstrosity had context. What makes Vlad's legacy endure isn't just the gore, it's the uneasy question he forces us to confront. When does a man become a monster? When does history bleed into myth? The real Dracula never slept in a coffin or turned into a bat, but he proved something far more unsettling. Humanity's capacity for cruelty needs no supernatural explanation. The vampire legend merely gave his darkness wings, and in that way, Vlad the Impaler did achieve a kind of immortality, not through undeath, but through the stories we can't stop telling about him. The early 1700s didn't just bring Enlightenment ideals to Europe, they unleashed a panic so pervasive, it forced emperors and scholars to grapple with the existence of vampires. Nowhere was this hysteria more visceral than in the remote villages of Serbia and Hungary, where the dead were said to rise with horrifying regularity. Take the case of Peter Plagojevich, a peasant from the village of Kisilova. When he died in 1725, his passing should have been unremarkable. But within weeks, 9 villagers dropped dead one after another, each claiming in their final breaths that Plagojevich had visited them at night, choking the life from their bodies. What happened next reads like a scene from a horror novel. At the urging of terrified locals, officials exhumed Plagojevich's body, and what they found sent shockwaves through the region. Contemporary reports describe a corpse with fresh blood oozing from its mouth, skin ruddy and supple, and fingernails that had continued growing after burial. Most damning of all, his heart, when pierced, gushed liquid blood as if he just fed. The response was swift and brutal. Villagers drove a stake through his chest, burned the body, and scattered the ashes. But this wasn't superstition run wild. It was a meticulously documented event, witnessed by imperial officials who filed formal reports. Plagojevich's case wasn't isolated. Across the Austrian Empire, similar incidents erupted like a contagion. In Medvedja, another Serbian village, a wave of deaths in 1732 was blamed on a recently deceased man named Arnold Paole. When his grave was opened, his body showed the same grotesque signs: pliable limbs, blood pooled in the chest, and a mouth stained crimson. But this time, the hysteria multiplied. Paole had allegedly returned once before after eating the blood of a vampire himself. Now, the curse seemed to spread through his victims, creating a macabre chain reaction. Authorities exhumed and mutilated over a dozen bodies, staking and decapitating them in a frantic attempt to stop the outbreak. What made these cases so explosive wasn't just the gore, it was how they forced the educated elite to confront folklore as potential fact. Gerard van Swieten, Empress Maria Theresa's personal physician, was dispatched to investigate. His conclusion: the vampires were victims of decomposition misinterpreted by terrified peasants. Bodies bloated from gas, blood seeped from natural post-mortem pooling, and the illusion of growth in hair and nails came from skin retraction. Yet even his rational explanation couldn't quell the fear. The reports spread like wildfire, reprinted in newspapers from Paris to London, fueling debates in salons and universities. This wasn't just mass hysteria, it was a collision of science and superstition. In an age before germ theory, when diseases like tuberculosis wasted victims, slowly leaving them pale, coughing blood, vampire lore offered a grotesquely logical explanation. If the dead could rise to drain the living, it made sense that plagues seemed to cluster around certain families or graves. The Church's own teachings blurred the lines further, with beliefs in incorruptible saints whose bodies resisted decay, proof that under divine influence, flesh might defy nature. The 18th century vampire epidemics left an indelible mark, not just on folklore, but on how we process fear. These weren't campfire tales, they were crises that reshaped laws, with Austria outlawing grave desecrations in response. More hauntingly, they revealed a universal truth: when faced with the inexplicable, humanity will always invent monsters, because sometimes the real horror isn't what waits in the grave, it's not knowing why the dying won't stop. Before modern medicine understood the science of decomposition, graveyards became stages for macabre misunderstandings that fueled vampire panic. Imagine a 17th-century villager exhuming a loved 1 week after burial, only to find the corpse swollen, lips pulled back in a grotesque grin, and dark liquid trickling from the mouth. To terrified eyes, this wasn't natural decay, it was proof the dead had been feeding. The bloating, a stomach full of stolen blood, the fresh complexion, a sign of recent nighttime hunting. Even the muffled screams of those accidentally buried alive could be twisted into tales of undead stirring in their coffins. Take the phenomenon of cadaveric syneresis, where decomposing bodies expel blood-tinged fluid through the mouth. In villages across Eastern Europe, this was misinterpreted as evidence of recent feeding. Corpses found with their burial shrouds chewed, a common occurrence as gases distended the abdomen and the mouth's soft tissues collapsed, were branded as Nachseiras, German for after-devourers, believed to be eating their own flesh before turning on the living. The logic seemed sound: if a body wasn't decaying properly, it must be sustaining itself somehow. But the horrors didn't stop there. In an era before stethoscopes, diagnosing death was perilously unreliable. Catalepsy, a condition causing rigid limbs and barely detectable breathing, led to countless premature burials. Victims would awaken underground, clawing at coffins until their fingers bled, leaving telltale wounds later interpreted as self-inflicted by vampires. The infamous case of 19th-century composer Niccolò Paganini, whose body refused to decompose for weeks due to a genetic condition, sparked rumors he'd sold his soul for immortality. Even the simplest natural processes became sinister, hair and nails appearing to grow post-mortem, really just skin retracting, convinced communities the dead were regenerating. Medical journals of the era reveal desperate attempts to rationalize these phenomena. Physicians like French anatomist Jacques Benin Winslow published treatises on signs of true death, advocating methods like holding mirrors to mouths or placing leeches on skin to detect breath. Yet fear often overruled science. When tuberculosis ravaged families, leaving victims pale, weak, and coughing blood, the idea of a spectral predator draining their vitality offered a twisted comfort. At least it wasn't random. At least you could fight back. This collision of medicine and myth reached its peak with the vampire graves of 18th century New England. In Rhode Island, Mercy Brown's exhumation in 1892 revealed her heart still containing fresh blood, likely preserved by winter temperatures. Her father, following folkloric rituals, burned her heart and fed the ashes to her dying brother, a last-ditch cure that, unsurprisingly, failed. What's chilling isn't just the acts themselves, but their persistence into an age of growing scientific enlightenment. Vampires weren't just monsters, they were placeholders for the mysteries medicine couldn't yet solve, a reminder that sometimes the darkest shadows are cast not by the supernatural, but by the limits of human understanding. The shift from whispered folklore to ink-stained pages didn't happen overnight, but when vampires finally clawed their way into literature, they arrived not with a whisper, but a snarl. The first tremors appeared in the mid-18th century, when German poet Heinrich August Ossenfelder penned The Vampire in 1748. This short, chilling poem didn't just describe a monster, it gave the creature a voice. Softly, my dear, be trembling with fear, the vampire croons to a virtuous maiden, his words dripping with seductive menace. For the first time, the blood drinker wasn't just a mindless revenant from a grave, he was a predator with personality, a corrupter of innocence. Ossenfelder's vampire wasn't folklore's bloated corpse, he was a shadow in a drawing room, a threat wrapped in sophistication. This transformation found fertile ground in the Gothic literature boom of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Writers like John Polidori, Lord Byron's personal physician, took Ossenfelder's template and injected it with aristocratic venom. Polidori's The Vampire, 1819, introduced Lord Ruthven, a charming nobleman with a taste for high society and fresh blood. Ruthven wasn't just a monster, he was a mirror held up to the upper class, a parasite preying on the very circles that welcomed him. The story's twist. His victims didn't just die, they became vampires themselves, spreading the curse like a fashionable disease. The parallels to Byron's own scandalous reputation weren't subtle, blurring the line between fiction and the whispers of London's elite. But the Gothic era's true gift to vampire lore was atmosphere. Novels like Varney, the vampires serialized in the 1840s, turned the creature into a tragic figure, cursed with immortality and tormented by his own hunger. Varney's lengthy monologues filled with self-loathing and existential dread paved the way for the brooding, complex vampires we know today. Meanwhile, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, 1872, introduced something even more radical, a female vampire whose allure wasn't just dangerous, but explicitly erotic. Set in a fog-draped Austrian castle, the story explored themes of forbidden desire and obsession, with Carmilla's relationship to her victim, Laura, vibrating with unspoken tension. Here, the vampire wasn't just a threat to life, it was a threat to societal norms. What made these early literary vampires so enduring wasn't just their fangs or their thirst, it was their humanity. Folklore's monsters were forces of nature, but Gothic literature gave them motives, regrets, and cunning. They moved from graveyards to ballrooms, from peasant nightmares to the anxieties of the educated elite. By the time Bram Stoker sat down to write Dracula in 1897, the vampire had already been refined through decades of storytelling. The Count didn't emerge from nowhere. He was the culmination of a century's worth of experiments in terror. And in that way, the Gothic writers didn't just create characters. They built a lexicon of fear that still bleeds into our stories today. John Polidori's The Vampire didn't just introduce a new monster, it birthed an icon. Published in 1819, this slender, sinister tale marked the moment vampires left peasant superstition behind and stepped into the drawing rooms of high society. At its heart stood Lord Ruthven, a character so dripping with aristocratic menace that he became the blueprint for every brooding, elegant vampire to follow. But what made Ruthven revolutionary wasn't just his polished veneer, it was the way he weaponized it. Unlike the bloated, grave, stinking revenants of Slavic folklore, Ruthven moved through London's elite circles like a shadow, his charm as sharp as his fangs. He didn't lurk in crypts, he attended balls, seduced heiresses, and left his victims both social and literal drained in his wake. The story's origins were as dramatic as its plot. Polidori, Lord Byron's personal physician, crafted the vampire during the infamous Year Without a Summer in 1816, when volcanic ash from Mount Tambura's eruption plunged Europe into darkness. Trapped inside a Swiss villa with Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley, who'd soon pen Frankenstein, Polidori spun his tale from a fragment Byron had discarded. The result was a vampire unlike any before, a reflection of the Romantic era's fascination with tortured geniuses and moral decay. Ruthven wasn't just a predator, he was a parasite, a dark mirror to the aristocracy's excesses. His victims didn't just die, they became vampires themselves, spreading the curse like a fashionable contagion. Polidori's genius lay in his fusion of folklore and contemporary fears. Traditional vampires were grotesque, their monstrous natures visible in decay. Ruthven, by contrast, hid his corruption behind a mask of sophistication. He embodied the era's anxieties about hidden vices, the fear that behind the glittering surface of high society, something rotten festered. This Byronic vampire archetype, charismatic, melancholic, and utterly amoral, would echo through centuries of literature, from Anne Rice's Lestat to Twilight's Carlyle Cullen. Even the word vampire gained new shades of meaning after Polidori. No longer just a folkloric ghoul, it became shorthand for any charismatic predator who fed on the vulnerable. But the vampire's most lasting twist was its blurring of fiction and reality. Rumors swirled that Ruthven was based on Byron himself, a reading fueled by Polidori's thinly veiled resentments toward his employer. Byron's reputation as a seductive, scandalous figure made the connection irresistible. The public devoured the idea that their literary idol might harbor a darker nature, and the story's initial publication, attributed to Byron in some editions, only deepened the mystique. In one stroke, Polidori turned vampirism from a peasant superstition into a metaphor for the corrupting power of fame, wealth, and unchecked desire. What makes the vampire endure isn't just its prose, it's the tectonic shift it created. Before Polidori, vampires were monsters to be staked. After him, they became mirrors, reflecting our deepest fears about class, morality, and the masks we wear. Ruthven didn't just drink blood, he exposed the hypocrisy of an era obsessed with appearances, and in doing so, he ensured that the vampire would never again be just a creature of the grave. He made it a creature of the human soul. Long before vampires stalked the silver screen, they lurked in the Inkai pages of cheap serialized fiction, and none left a deeper bite mark than Varney the Vampire. First published in penny dreadful installments between 1845 and 1847, this sprawling, melodramatic epic didn't just introduce tropes, it weaponized them. Sir Francis Varney was a revelation, a vampire who didn't just hiss and hunt, but agonized over his curse. His elongated fangs, mesmerizing gaze, and superhuman strength became the blueprint for modern vampire fiction, but his tortured soul was the real innovation. Here was a monster who wept over his own hunger, who leaped into the sea to escape his nature only to be resurrected by moonlight. This wasn't folklore's mindless revenant. This was a creature of pathos, a template for every brooding vampire from Lestat to Edward Cullen. The sheer scale of Varney was unprecedented. At nearly 200 chapters and over 600,000 words, it devoured readers' imaginations with a mix of Gothic horror and soap opera twists. Varney himself was a shape-shifting paradox, aristocratic yet bestial, ruthless yet remorseful. In one scene, he'd tear open a victim's throat with his fangs. In the next, he'd deliver monologues about the agony of immortality. This emotional complexity was revolutionary, especially for penny dreadfuls, which were typically dismissed as lowbrow entertainment. But Varney's popularity proved there was an appetite for monsters with depth, and its episodic structure kept readers hooked with cliffhangers that wouldn't feel out of place in modern TV dramas. What made Varney truly transformative, though, was its embellishment of vampire mythology. The novel codified tropes we now take for granted: the vampire's hypnotic powers, his ability to scale walls like a spider, even his vulnerability to sunlight, a detail often mistakenly credited to Dracula decades later. And then there were the fangs. While folklore described vampires with elongated teeth, Varney made them iconic, describing their gleam with such lurid detail that the image stuck. Even the vampire's dramatic rebirths after seemingly fatal stakings or drownings mirrored the serial's own addictive, cyclical nature. Readers couldn't escape Varney, just as Varney couldn't escape his curse. The penny dreadful format itself played a role in the story's wild success. Sold for a penny per installment, these booklets were the 19th century equivalent of binge-worthy streaming content, devoured by factory workers and clerks alike. The writing was frantic, sometimes contradictory thanks to multiple authors ghostwriting under the pseudonym James Malcolm Rymer, but that only added to its chaotic charm. Varney wasn't just a story, it was a cultural event, proving that horror could be both mass-market and psychologically rich. Its legacy flickers through every sympathetic vampire since, from Interview with the Vampire's Louis to What We Do in the Shadows' Reluctant Killers. The next time you see a vampire wince as they lower their fangs toward a victim's neck, remember that inner conflict started with a penny dreadful's most infamous aristocrat of the night. 75 years before Dracula ever stepped onto English shores, another vampire was already weaving her spell, one clad not in masculine menace, but in silk and whispered secrets. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, published in 1872, didn't just introduce literature's first iconic female vampire, it shattered conventions with a story drenched in Gothic atmosphere and unspoken desire. Set in an isolated Austrian castle, the novella follows Laura, a young woman whose quiet life unravels when the mysterious Carmilla arrives beautiful, melancholic, and harboring a chilling secret. Their relationship blooms with an intimacy that fluttered far beyond Victorian propriety, lingering touches, feverish dreams, and Laura's growing weakness as Carmilla's nocturnal visits drain her vitality. This wasn't just horror, it was seduction disguised as sisterhood, a slow poison dripped from ruby lips. Carmilla's brilliance lies in what she represents. Unlike the grotesque revenants of folklore or even Polidori's predatory Lord Ruthven, she weaponizes femininity itself. Her vampirism isn't brute force, it's an insidious corruption, masked by candlelit conversations and tender caresses. Le Fanu paints her as both predator and victim, a creature cursed with eternal hunger, yet genuinely drawn to Laura even as she destroys her. This duality terrified Victorian readers far more than any fanged monster could. Because Carmilla didn't just drink blood, she exposed the era's deepest taboos. Her bond with Laura pulsed with erotic tension, from shared baths to midnight embraces, all wrapped in language that dared to whisper what society forbade. When Laura describes Carmilla's kisses as leaving her breathless and exhausted, the subtext was unmistakable. This was desire dressed in horror's clothing. The novella's influence stretches like shadow across vampire lore. Carmilla's tragic backstory, revealed to be the centuries-old Countess Mercale Karnstein, inspired Anne Rice's sympathetic vampires decades later. Her habit of targeting exclusively female victims prefigured the lesbian vampire trope, echoed in films like The Hunger and Daughters of Darkness. Even Dracula owes her a debt. Stoker borrowed Le Fanu's structure of fragmented diaries and letters, along with the theme of contagion spreading through intimate contact. But perhaps her most enduring legacy is the femme fatale archetype, the beautiful destroyer whose allure is as deadly as her fangs. From Buffy the Vampire Slayer's Drusilla to True Blood's Pam, every seductive female vampire carries a trace of Carmilla's perfume. What makes Carmilla timeless isn't just its queer subtext or Gothic chills. It's how Le Fanu understood that the scariest monsters are the ones we invite in. Dracula crashed through windows. Carmilla slipped through the cracks of propriety, her love letters written in puncture wounds. In a world that feared female sexuality as something to be locked away, she was the nightmare version of what might happen if it ever got free. And in that, she proved more revolutionary and more dangerous than any vampire who came after. Bram Stoker didn't just write a novel in 1897. He forged a myth so enduring it eclipsed centuries of folklore. Dracula wasn't born in a vacuum. Stoker spent years stitching together threads from history, legend, and his own nightmares to create a monster that would redefine horror. He borrowed Vlad the Impaler's name and brutality, blended them with Transylvanian superstitions about Strigoi, and wrapped it all in the sleek menace of Gothic fiction's aristocratic villains. But the Count's genius wasn't just in his ingredients, it was in his timing. Published at the twilight of the Victorian era, Dracula tapped into fears of repressed desire, foreign contagion, and the fragility of British imperialism. Here was a creature who didn't merely kill, he corrupted, transforming proper English ladies into ravenous seductresses and turning blood, the very symbol of purity, into a vehicle for shame. Stoker's research was obsessive. He pored over travelogues of Eastern Europe, studying maps of the Carpathians until he could describe Dracula's castle with eerie precision. He devoured Emily Gerard's Transylvanian superstitions, lifting details like the vampire's aversion to garlic and inability to cast a reflection. Even the novel's structure, a patchwork of diaries, letters, and newspaper clippings, mirrored the fragmented way folklore spreads, whispering from one source to another. But the real alchemy happened when Stoker fused these elements with contemporary anxieties. Dracula's journey to England aboard the Demeter mirrored real-life immigrant waves, playing on fears of foreign contamination. His ability to control rats and wolves tapped into Victorian terror of disease and unchecked nature. and his seduction of Lucy Westenra, a direct challenge to the era's rigid sexual mores, where a single bite could unleash uninhibited hunger. The novel's cultural impact was immediate and seismic. Stage adaptations proliferated within years, culminating in Bela Lugosi's iconic 1931 film portrayal, which cemented the vampire's tuxedoed elegance. But Dracula's deeper legacy lies in how it reshaped the monster's DNA. Before Stoker, vampires were often mindless, rotting predators. Dracula was different, a cultured polymath who quoted poetry, manipulated legal contracts, and moved through high society like a shadow. This wasn't just a monster to fear, it was one to admire, a dark reflection of human ambition. Modern vampire fiction, from Anne Rice's Tortured Immortals to Twilight's Glittering Cullens, all owe their existential angst to Stoker's creation. Even the vampire's vulnerability to sunlight, now a cornerstone of the myth, was popularized by the novel's staging, not the text itself, proof of how fluidly the legend evolved. Yet for all its innovations, Dracula remains rooted in ancient fears. The Count's shape-shifting echoes Slavic tales of vampires transforming into mist or wolves. His need to sleep in native soil mirrors folklore's belief that vampires are tied to their homeland, and the famous staking of Lucy, a direct lift from peasant rituals documented in 18th century vampire panics. Stoker's brilliance was in dressing these old terrors in modern trappings, making them feel both timeless and urgently new. The novel's final irony, Dracula himself has become more than a character, he's a mirror, reflecting whatever era he stalks. In the 1950s, he was a Cold War infiltrator. In the 21st century, a metaphor for corporate greed or viral pandemics. The Count may have turned to dust at the novel's end, but his curse and his power only grew stronger with time. While Bram Stoker's Dracula borrowed Vlad the Impaler's name, another historical monster may have shaped the Count's thirst. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. Born in 1560 to Hungarian nobility, Bathory's alleged crimes read like a vampire's ledger. Over 600 victims, mostly young women, drained of blood for her baths. Though historians debate the numbers, her trial was politically motivated, the legend stuck. Stoker likely encountered her story while researching Eastern European folklore, and the parallels are striking. Both Dracula and Bathory were aristocrats who defied mortality, one through undeath, the other through the myth that bathing in virgin blood preserved youth. But where Dracula was a foreign invader, Bathory represented a horror from within, a predator hiding behind wealth and privilege, her castle a gilded slaughterhouse. Yet Stoker's genius lay in blending fact with obscure myth. Beyond Vlad and Bathory, he drew from the Slavic Vampyre, a corpse that returned to feast on kin, a betrayal more intimate than any Gothic horror. Folkloric Vampyre weren't just blood drinkers, they spread plague, cursed crops, and commanded animals, traits Stoker repurposed for Dracula's control over wolves and rats. Even the Count's shape-shifting echoes lesser-known Carpathian tales of vampires transforming into fog or insects to slip through cracks. These details didn't come from dusty libraries. Stoker corresponded with Hungarian professor Armin van Buren, who fed him first-hand accounts of Transylvanian superstitions. That oral tradition lent Dracula its eerie authenticity, the sense that these horrors weren't invented, but excavated. But the novel's darkest ingredient might be Stoker's own life. Some scholars trace Dracula's predatory sexuality to the author's repressed desires in Victorian society, while others see shadows of his childhood bedridden with illness, listening to his mother's chilling tales of cholera epidemics and spectral Walking Dead. Even Dracula's looming threat to England mirrors Stoker's fears as an Irishman witnessing British imperialism's fractures. The real horror of Dracula isn't just its monsters, but how Stoker stitched them from history's wounds, folklore's whispers, and his own nightmares. The Count endures because he's not one monster, but many, a collage of every terror we've ever named, and those too dark to speak aloud. Long before vampires stalked Hollywood sound stages, they slithered into the flickering shadows of silent cinema, and none left a more indelible mark than Count Orlok in Nosferatu. Released in 1922, this unauthorized adaptation of Dracula became far more than a stolen story. It birthed an entirely new visual language for horror. Director F.W. Murnau hadn't just read Bram Stoker's novel, he'd weaponized it, transforming Dracula into a rat-faced monstrosity with claw-like fingers and sunken, hollow eyes. Orlok didn't seduce, he repulsed, his elongated silhouette creeping up staircases like a living nightmare, but the real horror unfolded off-screen. Stoker's widow, Florence, sued the production for copyright infringement, demanding every copy be destroyed. The court agreed, yet like the vampires it depicted, Nosferatu refused to die. A handful of prints survived, ensuring Orlok's gaunt visage would haunt audiences for generations. Silent cinema's constraints became its greatest strength when depicting the undead. Without dialogue, filmmakers relied on stark contrasts of light and shadow, a technique called German expressionism, to convey dread. Orlok's movements weren't just eerie, they were unnatural, achieved through undercranked cameras that made his gestures jerky and insectile. His shadow, creeping independently up walls, turned absence into a predator. And those fingers stretched like skeletal talons weren't just practical effects, they were symbols, where later vampires would charm, Orlok infected, his very presence warping the world around him. The film's plague subtext wasn't subtle. Rats followed him, townsfolk sickened in his wake. In an era still reeling from the Spanish flu, the metaphor was as visceral as a bite to the neck. But Nosferatu wasn't alone in shaping the vampire's cinematic grammar. 4 years earlier, the Vampyre, 1918, had introduced the trope of the vampire as a seductress, though prints were lost to time. Meanwhile, London After Midnight, 1927, starred Lon Chaney as a fake vampire whose razor teeth and hypnotic glare influenced later portrayals tragically. The film burned in a vault fire, leaving only stills to hint at its terror. What united these early works was their tactile grotesquerie. Without sound, vampires couldn't whisper sweet nothings. They had to move like nightmares, their menace etched in every frame. The legacy of silent-era vampires lingers in the way we film horror even today. Orlok's disjointed motion inspired Tim Burton's stop-motion animation in The Nightmare Before Christmas. The play of shadows he pioneered lives on in the Babadook's silhouette sequences, and that infamous shot of Orlok rising stiffly from his coffin. It's echoed in every zombie film from Night of the Living Dead to Train to Busan. Silent cinema didn't just depict vampires, it taught us how to fear them, proving that sometimes the most chilling screams are the ones we never hear. When Universal Pictures released Dracula in 1931, they didn't just make a movie, they created an icon. Bela Lugosi's piercing stare, his slow, deliberate movements, and that thick Hungarian accent didn't just define the Count, they rewrote vampire mythology forever. Unlike the grotesque Nosferatu, Lugosi's Dracula oozed aristocratic charm, gliding through candlelit corridors in a cape that seemed to move with a life of its own. His first words, "I am Dracula," weren't a growl but a purr, a velvet invitation into the dark. This wasn't a monster lurking in shadows. This was a predator who held doors open for his victims, whose menace was wrapped in the trappings of high society. The film's genius lay in this contradiction, a creature who could be both gentleman and ghoul, whose very politeness made him more terrifying. Lugosi's performance didn't come out of nowhere. He'd honed the role on Broadway, immersing himself in the part until the line between actor and count blurred. That dedication seeped into every frame, the way he held a wine glass like a chalice, the hypnotic cadence of his voice, even the stillness of his hands, which seemed to coil like a snake about to strike. Critics at the time noted how his Dracula didn't just scare audiences, he enchanted them. Women in theaters reportedly sighed when he appeared, a reaction that would have been unthinkable for the fanged horrors of silent cinema. This was Hollywood's first lesson in vampire allure. Terror could be sexy. The film's visual language cemented this shift. Cinematographer Carl Freund used lingering close-ups to emphasize Lugosi's otherworldly presence, his eyes reflecting candlelight like a cat's. The now iconic shot of Dracula descending the staircase, his cape billowing without wind, wasn't just dramatic, it was myth-making. Even the absence of sound in key moments, like the creak of his coffin opening, forced audiences to lean in, making them complicit in the horror. Universal's Dracula wasn't just watched, it was experienced, a dreamlike descent into elegance and dread. But Lugosi's real legacy wasn't just his performance, it was how Hollywood latched onto his interpretation and never let go. Suddenly, vampires weren't just creatures to be feared, they were figures to be desired. The film's success spawned a wave of imitators, each dialing up the seduction. By the 1950s, Christopher Lee's Dracula would amp up the sexuality, his fangs glistening like diamonds. Later, Anne Rice's interview with the vampire would turn Lugosi's template inward, exploring the loneliness beneath the glamour. Even today's brooding vampire romances, from Twilight to the Vampire Diaries, owe their DNA to that 1931 film. Yet Lugosi's shadow stretched beyond the screen. His portrayals seeped into pop culture, inspiring everything from Sesame Street's Count Von Count to Gary Oldman's shape-shifting Dracula in 1992. The trope of the vampire as tortured sophisticate the monster who quotes poetry, who mourns his own damnation started here, and perhaps most tellingly, when Marvel Comics needed a villain noble enough to rival their heroes, they modeled Dracula's look and demeanor directly on Lugosi. The irony, the actor himself grew to resent the role, typecast as a horror star until his death. In a twist worthy of his most famous character, Lugosi became a prisoner of the very myth he helped create. What makes Universal's Dracula endure isn't just its scares, it's how it reshaped our nightmares. Before Lugosi, vampires were things that went bump in the night. After him, they were the ones whispering your name in the dark, making you wonder if the real horror wasn't the bites, but how much you might like it. Hollywood didn't just glamorize vampires that year, it gave them fangs sharp enough to pierce the collective psyche forever. By the 1950s, Universal's Gothic horror cycle had run its course, until a small British studio hammered the vampire myth back to life, this time drenched in crimson and dripping with desire. Hammer Films didn't just resurrect Dracula, they reinvented him, trading shadowy castles for lurid Technicolor nightmares and transforming Christopher Lee's Count into a towering, feral aristocrat with eyes that burned like embers. Where Lugosi had whispered, Lee pounced, his fangs glistening with blood that for the first time on screen looked shockingly, viscerally red. This wasn't just horror, it was horror with teeth, a riot of velvet and violence that mirrored the era's unraveling taboos. The genius of Hammer's Dracula, 1958, lay in its unapologetic excess. Director Terence Fisher flooded the screen with ruby-rich hues, lush burgundies, sickly greens, and that infamous blood, so vivid it practically dripped from the projector. But the real revolution was in Lee's portrayal. His Dracula didn't stalk, he consumed, radiating raw sexual energy as he cornered victims with animalistic hunger. When he buried his fangs into a swooning heroine's neck, audiences didn't just see a monster, they saw desire weaponized. Hammer's vampires weren't cursed nobles mourning their lost humanity. They were hedonists reveling in their appetites, their thirst as much about pleasure as survival. And Hammer's female vampires, played by actresses like Ingrid Pitt, flipped the script entirely here. Women weren't just prey, but predators who wielded their allure like a knife. This shift wasn't accidental. Post-war Britain was simmering with suppressed tension, the shadow of nuclear dread, the creeping liberalization of sexuality, the crumbling facade of Victorian propriety. Hammer's films held up a mirror to these anxieties, framing vampirism not as a curse, but a release. When Peter Cushing's Van Helsing drove a stake through a vampire's heart, the subtext was unmistakable. This wasn't just killing a monster, it was punishing transgression itself. The Count's victims didn't just die, they transformed, shedding their demure petticoats for diaphanous gowns and hungry stares, their moans of terror blending disturbingly with pleasure. Yet for all their titillation, Hammer's vampires were deeply tragic. Lee's Dracula, though ferocious, carried a weariness beneath his fury, a king dethroned, endlessly resurrected only to be hunted again. This melancholy threaded through the studio's golden age, from the brides of Dracula's doomed romances to Kiss of the Vampire's operatic despair. Even the film's Catholic imagery, crosses, holy water, crumbling chapels hinted at a world where faith couldn't quite contain the chaos of human hunger. Hammer's legacy isn't just in the blood they spilled, but the boundaries they shattered. Without Lee's smoldering intensity, there'd be no Lest at lounging in velvet splendor. Without Pitt's Carmilla, True Blood's vampire orgies might have stayed in the shadows. Most importantly, Hammer proved horror could be sensual, that fear and desire could coil together like lovers in a crypt, their intertwined whispers echoing long after the credits rolled. The studio may have folded by the 1980s, but their vision of the vampire as both terror and temptation burns brighter than ever. After all, what's more terrifying and thrilling than realizing the monster might just seduce you first? Bram Stoker may have cast the mold, but 20th-century authors shattered it, reinventing the vampire as a creature of psychological torment and unsettling humanity. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, 1976, didn't just tell a vampire's story, it handed him the microphone. Louis, the novel's brooding protagonist, was a revelation, a vampire who wept over his kills, who agonized over his own monstrosity, and whose narration turned the genre inside out. No longer a mere predator, he became a philosopher of the night, his existential crises mirroring the disillusionment of post-Vietnam America. Rice's New Orleans wasn't a Gothic stage set, it was a lush, decaying playground where immortality felt less like a curse and more like a fever dream of guilt and desire. And then there was Lest, at the flamboyant, amoral rock star of the undead, whose charisma made evil irresistible. Rice didn't just write about vampires, she gave them interiority, crafting a mythology where bloodlust was tangled with artistry, loneliness, and the search for meaning. Stephen King took the vampire in a Chinese letter different direction with Salem's Lot, 1975. Where Rice's creatures shimmered with tragic glamour, King's Kurt Barlow was a primal nightmare, a bald, feral ghoul who turned an entire small town into a feeding ground. King understood that true horror wasn't just the monster, but the slow erosion of normalcy. The real terror of Salem's Lot wasn't Barlow himself. It was watching neighbors vanish, kids morph into predators, and the local priest crumple under the weight of his own doubt. King grounded vampirism in the soil of American suburbia, making it feel as mundane as a flickering streetlight, and twice as menacing. His vampires weren't romantic anti-heroes, they were vermin, spreading like a plague through the town's veins. Between these two poles, 20th century literature stretched vampire mythology like a rubber band. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough's Hotel Transylvania, 1978, gave us Saint Germain, a vampire who channeled his centuries into benevolence, becoming a patron of the arts and a reluctant romantic. Poppy Z. Bright's Lost Souls, 1992, dragged the creature into the grunge era, with androgynous punk vampires who oozed nihilism and neon-lit decadence. Even children's literature got a taste, with The Little Vampire, 1979, turning fangs into a metaphor for outsiderhood. What united these works wasn't just their shared obsession with the undead, it was their willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. What if immortality wasn't a blessing, but a prison sentence? What if the monster wasn't a foreign invader, but the boy next door? By the turn of the 21st century, vampires had become blank canvases, reflecting everything from AIDS paranoia to queer identity. Rice and King didn't just write stories, they cracked open the coffin lid, proving that the most enduring monsters are the ones that force us to stare into the mirror and wonder what's staring back. Vampires have never just been monsters, they're mirrors, reflecting the darkest corners of whatever culture they haunt. Take the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 90s, when the vampire myth took on a chilling new resonance. Suddenly, creatures who spread their curse through intimate exchange of bodily fluids weren't just folklore, they were metaphors for a real-world epidemic. Films like The Hunger, 1983, leaned hard into this parallel, with its slow-motion scenes of blood mingling like contaminated needles. David Bowie's and Catherine Deneuve's glamorous vampires weren't just seductive, they were deadly in ways that felt uncomfortably familiar to audiences watching friends waste away from an incurable disease. The horror wasn't in the bite itself, but in the aftermath, the agonizing wait to see if you'd been infected, the way a single moment of passion could unravel a life. Vampires became the embodiment of society's panic, its stigma, its desperate search for someone or something to blame, but the metaphor cuts deeper than disease. Vampires have always been the ultimate others, outsiders who threaten the status quo simply by existing. Let the Right One in 2008 transformed this idea into something heartbreakingly human. Its child vampire, Illy, isn't just a predator, she's a lonely figure caught between need and longing. Her relationship with the bullied Oscar echoing the alienation of anyone who's ever felt like a freak. The film's snowy Swedish backdrop turns every frame into a metaphor for emotional isolation, with vampirism standing in for any difference society fears: queerness, disability, even just the quiet sadness of not fitting in. When Ellie whispers, "I'm not a girl," it's not just a reveal, it's a rejection of labels, a refusal to be pinned down by the rules of a world that wouldn't understand her anyway. Then there's the vampire as a symbol of repressed desire. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla was ahead of its time in using vampirism to explore queer love, but modern works like What We Do in the Shadows twist the trope into something slyly subversive. The vampires of Staten Island aren't just bloodsuckers, they're stand-ins for anyone living on society's fringes. Their immortality, a metaphor for how marginalized identities persist despite attempts to erase them. Even Twilight, for all its glossy romance, taps into the fear of abstinence and temptation, with Edward's struggle to resist Bella's blood reading like a supernatural spin on teenage sexual anxiety. The brilliance of the vampire as metaphor lies in its fluidity. In only lovers left alive, they're jaded artists mourning the death of culture. In Blade, they're corporate elites literally feeding on the underclass. Every generation gets the vampires it deserves, monsters that don't just scare us, but make us ask why we're scared in the first place. Whether they're symbols of disease, desire, or defiance, vampires will always be more than creatures of the night. They're the shadows we can't outrun, the truths we're afraid to speak aloud, and that's why they'll never truly die. When Buffy the Vampire Slayer premiered in 1997, it didn't just introduce a new kind of hero, it tore up the rulebook on what vampires could be. Gone were the brooding aristocrats and feral monsters of earlier eras. In their place stood a razor-sharp blend of horror, wit, and raw emotional honesty that turned the genre inside out. At its core, Buffy wasn't just about staking vampires. It was about surviving high school, first love, and the terrifying uncertainty of growing up, with fangs as a metaphor for every hidden battle teenagers face. The show's genius lay in its balance. One moment, you're laughing at Spike's sarcastic one-liners. The next, you're gutted by Angel's tragic curse or the raw vulnerability of a vampire like Harmony, who just wanted to be popular, even in death. Joss Whedon's creation didn't just play with vampire lore, it reinvented it. Sunnydale's vampires weren't cursed nobles or mindless ghouls. They were a mixed bag of personalities, from the soulless master to the morally ambiguous Spike, who evolved from villain to antihero in a way audiences had never seen. The show's mythology was equally groundbreaking. Vampires weren't just born from bites. They were demons wearing the faces of the dead, a twist that added layers of grief and horror when characters like Angel regained their human souls only to drown in guilt. The infamous Angelus arc, where Buffy's lover lost his soul and became a sadistic killer, wasn't just a plot twist. It was a masterclass in how vampirism could mirror the darkest sides of human nature. But perhaps Buffy's most enduring legacy was its refusal to paint vampires in black and white. Spike's journey from big bad to reluctant ally, complete with a chip in his brain that forced him to confront his own violence, challenged viewers to ask, can monsters change? His twisted, toxic romance with Buffy blurred lines further, making audiences root for a relationship that was equal parts passionate and destructive. Even minor vampires like Dracula, with her haunting madness and childlike cruelty, added depth to a mythos that had often been one note, the show's secret sauce. It never let the supernatural overshadow the human stakes. When Buffy's mom found out her daughter was the Slayer, or when Willow's girlfriend Tara was murdered, the emotional weight hit harder than any wooden stake. The ripple effects of Buffy are everywhere today. Without it, there'd be no supernatural blending monsters with family drama, no teen wolf turning lycanthropy into adolescent angst, and certainly no Vampire Diaries with its love triangles and moral gray areas. But more than that, Buffy proved that horror could be heartfelt, that vampires could be as complex as the people watching them, and that sometimes the scariest thing isn't the monster under the bed, but the choices we make when no one's looking. The show didn't just redefine vampires for a new generation, it gave them souls in every sense of the word. Twilight didn't just rewrite vampire lore, it set it ablaze, igniting a cultural firestorm that split fans into warring camps. For some, Stephenie Meyer's saga was a betrayal of everything vampires stood for. Where was the Gothic horror, the blood-soaked tragedy, In their place stood Edward Cullen, a brooding heartthrob who sparkled in sunlight like a disco ball and treated his thirst for Bella's blood as an angsty inconvenience. Purists howled at the audacity. Vampires weren't supposed to be romantic leads. They were monsters, cursed and cruel. Yet for millions of readers, Twilight's radical reinvention wasn't sacrilege, it was liberation. Mayer's vampires weren't just creatures of the night, they were metaphors for abstinence, devotion, and the terrifying intensity of first love. The fact that Edward's greatest struggle wasn't surviving stakes or sunlight, but resisting the girl he adored, struck a chord with an audience hungry for fantasy that mirrored their own emotional chaos. What made Twilight's tropes so polarizing was how blatantly they defied tradition. Sparkling skin, a vegetarian vampire clan, a love triangle where the monster was the safer choice compared to a werewolf. These weren't just tweaks, they were grenades lobbed at centuries of folklore. Yet Mayer's genius lay in understanding that vampire myths had always evolved to reflect their era. The Byronic seducers of Gothic literature spoke to Victorian repression. Hammer's bloody hedonists mirrored the sexual revolution. Twilight, in turn, captured the anxieties of early 2000s adolescence. The obsession with purity, the fear of losing control, the allure of danger wrapped in a promise of eternal commitment. Edward's sparkling wasn't just a quirk, it was a visual representation of his unnatural perfection, a glittering facade masking something predatory, and that infamous love triangle. It weaponized the ultimate teenage dilemma. Do you choose the safe, passionate fantasy, Edward, or the warm, volatile reality, Jacob? The saga's cultural footprint is undeniable, for better or worse. It birthed a wave of paranormal romance where vampires morphed into tortured soulmates, their fangs retracting in favor of smoldering glances. Franchises like The Vampire Diaries and True Blood walked the line between Twilight's romance and traditional horror, but the genie was out of the coffin. Suddenly, vampires weren't just feared, they were shipped, their relationships dissected on Tumblr with the fervor of reality TV stars. Even the backlash became part of the phenomenon, with critics lambasting Bella as a passive heroine, while fans defended her as a quiet revolutionary, choosing her own fate in a world determined to control her. Twilight's real legacy isn't in its lore changes, it's in proving that vampire stories are infinitely adaptable. Mayer's vision resonated because it tapped into a truth older than Dracula. We don't just fear vampires, we identify with them. Their immortality mirrors our longing to be remembered. Their thirst parallels our own unchecked desires. Whether sparkling or savage, vampires will always reflect the era that breathes life into them. And if that means trading coffins for prom nights, well, the bloodline survives. The 21st century didn't just keep vampires alive, it gave them a makeover, splintering the myth into wildly different visions that prove just how elastic these creatures of the night can be. Take HBO's True Blood 2008, where vampirism wasn't just a curse, it was a radical new identity, set in a world where synthetic blood has allowed vampires to come out of the coffin. The show framed bloodsuckers as marginalized outsiders fighting for civil rights. Sookie Stackhouse's Louisiana wasn't stalked by shadows. It was drenched in neon and sweat, a place where vampire bars throbbed with the energy of underground queer clubs. Bill Compton and Eric Northman weren't just romantic leads, they were political animals, their power struggles mirroring real-world debates about assimilation versus pride. The genius of True Blood was how it weaponized vampirism as a metaphor for everything from homophobia to addiction, with fangs standing in for any trait that makes society clutch its pearls. But for every true blood drenched in southern Gothic grit, there's a What We Do in the Shadows, 2014, turning the myth into a punchline. This mockumentary about vampire roommates in New Zealand didn't just mock the genre, it reveled in its absurdity. Vladislav, the poker, couldn't seduce anyone if he tried. His idea of terrorizing the town was bickering over chores with his werewolf nemesis. Yet beneath the jokes lurked a sly commentary on immortality's tedium. These vampires weren't tormented by eternal night. They were bored by it, stuck in eternal roommate drama and struggling to pay rent. The brilliance of Shadows was how it humanized the inhuman, proving that even monsters worry about Wi-Fi passwords and proper flatmate etiquette. The contrast between these portrayals highlights the vampire's unique versatility. In Only Lovers Left Alive, 2013, Tom Hiddleston's Adam was a reclusive artist, centuries of existence weighing on him like a drug haze, while The Strain, 2014, reimagined vampires as parasitic bioweapons, their tendril-tongued attacks evoking body horror at its most visceral. Even children's media got in on the act. Hotel Transylvania, 2012, turned Dracula into an overprotective dad, his fangs softened by dad jokes and daddy issues. What binds these wildly different visions together is their refusal to let vampires stagnate. Whether they're symbols of otherness, vehicles for satire, or avatars of existential dread, vampires adapt because we need them to. They're the perfect metaphor, malleable enough to reflect our anxieties about love, power, or even just getting older, yet always, unmistakably, hungry. And as long as that hunger resonates, they'll keep evolving, one bloody bite at a time. At first glance, vampire myths seem too bizarre to have any basis in reality, until you peel back the layers of history and medicine. Take porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that makes sunlight feel like fire on the skin. Sufferers develop blisters, scarring, and even gum recession that exposes teeth unnaturally, giving them a fanged appearance. In medieval Europe, where entire families might inherit the condition, it's no wonder stories spread of cursed bloodlines recoiling from daylight, but the parallels go deeper. Porphyria disrupts heme production, leading to anemia so severe some patients were treated with animal blood, a desperate remedy that likely fueled rumors of blood drinking. The disease even explains vampires' supposed aversion to garlic. Sulfur compounds in the plant trigger painful attacks in porphyria patients. Suddenly, the myth stops being pure fantasy and starts looking like a twisted game of medical telephone, where symptoms became superstitions. Then there's rabies, a virus that transforms its victims into the very image of folklore's most violent vampires. The infected develop hydrophobia, not just fearing water, but reacting with spasms at the sight or sound of it, their throats locking as if repelled by holy water. They grow hypersensitive to light and noise, retreating to dark places like crypts. Most chillingly, rabies can cause aggressive biting and frothing at the mouth, with reports of sufferers attacking loved ones in frenzied states. In 18th century Hungary, where rabies outbreaks coincided with vampire panics, it's easy to see how a disease became a demon. Even the virus's transmission, through saliva entering the bloodstream, mirrors the vampiric bite. The rabid didn't just die, they died wrong, their bodies sometimes preserved by the virus's strange biochemistry, leaving corpses that appeared eerily lifelike for days. But perhaps the most heartbreaking explanation lies in catalepsy, a nervous system disorder that mimics death so perfectly victims were regularly buried alive. Heartbeats slow to undetectable levels, limbs stiffen like rigor mortis. Imagine waking in a coffin, scratching at the lid until your fingers bleed, only for gravediggers to later find the corpse moved, its mouth smeared with blood from screaming. No wonder Slavic folklore described vampires chewing through their burial shrouds. Historical records are littered with accounts of exhumed bodies found in unnatural positions, their faces contorted in terror. Before modern medicine, how could anyone know these were tragic misdiagnoses, not supernatural resurrections? Science doesn't just debunk these myths, it reveals the real horror behind them. Every fang, every aversion to sunlight, every undead corpse has roots in human suffering misunderstood by generations. The vampire isn't merely a monster. It's a mosaic of our ancestors' attempts to explain the unexplainable, a reminder that sometimes the truth hiding in the shadows is more unsettling than any legend. From the blood-drinking demons of Mesopotamia to the sparkling heartthrobs of modern cinema, vampires have shifted through time like mist through a graveyard. Their evolution isn't just a history of horror, it's a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fears and desires. Ancient cultures saw them as restless spirits punishing the living, while Gothic literature turned them into seductive aristocrats, their elegance masking a hunger that defied morality. The 20th century gave us tormented immortals wrestling with their own monstrosity, and today, they're everything from glittering romantic leads to gritty anti-heroes. What's astonishing isn't how much vampires have changed, but how effortlessly they adapt, slipping into each era's anxieties like a second skin. Why do these creatures of the night endure? Because they're the ultimate metaphor. Vampires embody what terrifies and fascinates us most: the allure of power, the fear of death, the tension between desire and restraint. They're outsiders who thrive in darkness, yet they're also deeply human, wrestling with loneliness, guilt, and the weight of centuries. Whether it's Dracula's aristocratic menace, Lestat's hedonistic rebellion, or Buffy's emotionally complex foes, vampires give form to the things we can't easily name. They're monsters we root for, villains we sympathize with, and sometimes reflections of our own hidden hungers. But perhaps the real secret to their immortality lies in their versatility. A vampire can be a cautionary tale about disease, a metaphor for queer identity, or even a stand-in for corporate greed. They're blank canvases, absorbing whatever fears or fantasies we project onto them. That's why they've survived every attempt to stake them, because they're not just creatures of folklore. They're part of us. Now we want to hear from you. Which vampire story left its mark on you? Is it the Gothic horror of Stoker's Dracula, the tragic romance of Anne Rice's Immortals, or something entirely unexpected? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the conversation about vampires is as endless as their afterlife. And who knows, maybe the next great vampire myth is lurking in your imagination right now, waiting for its moment to rise.